Ralphie May had a unique product, his own body. He sold the struggle of being nearly 400 pounds. He sold his labored breathing. On his last night in Vegas, he even dragged 6 weeks of severe pneumonia onto the stage, like a mandatory part of the act. The audience paid, and the show ended. The next morning, October 6, 2017, there were no more shows. He was found dead in a private residence in Las Vegas. Looking back, his entire career was built from that near-fatal crash at 16. He turned its aftermath into a ticket, landing second place on Last Comic Standing, releasing multiple specials on Netflix and Comedy Central, and touring nonstop. He had turned his physical struggle into a comedy brand. His story didn't start with laughter. It started with the silence of an ICU in a hospital bed. He was born Ralphie May on February 17, 1972, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But that was just a pin on a map. The place that would truly shape him, the place that would become the bedrock of his entire comedic identity, the soil from which his entire persona would grow, was Clarksville, Arkansas. This was not a place of nuance. This was the deep, unyielding American South of the 1970s and 80s. Clarksville, a small town in the Ozark foothills, was not just in the Bible Belt. It was a primary buckle on that belt. It was a world of rigid social norms, of fiery Sunday sermons that bled into Monday's laws. It was a place where conformity was not just encouraged, it was enforced. The lines were drawn clearly. You were an insider, a churchgoer, a football player, a member of a good family, or you were an outsider. And from the moment he could walk, Ralphie May was an outsider. He was the youngest of 4 children. His was not a happy home. It was not a place of safety or warmth. His parents' marriage was a battlefield. He would later describe it as a toxic, splintering, and violent thing that finally, mercifully broke apart. The fallout was devastating. The children, as children often are, became the collateral damage, the unfortunate repositories for their parents' bitterness, rage, and disappointment. His household was defined by tension, by shouting, by a constant humming anxiety. And underpinning all of it was a crushing, suffocating poverty. Money was more than tight. It was a constant gnawing absence. This wasn't the, oh, we can't afford that poverty of the middle class. This was the raw, fundamental poverty of what will we eat? This was the poverty of shame, of free school lunches, of clothes that never fit, of a deep and abiding feeling of being less than. This kind of poverty isn't just a circumstance. It's an identity. It seeps into your bones. It teaches you that you are not worth as much as the other kids. It teaches you to watch, to listen, to stay small, and to expect nothing. With his parents emotionally and often physically absent, the task of raising the May children fell to their maternal grandmother. She would become the single most important influence of his young life. She was not a soft, cookie-baking caricature of a grandmother. She was, as Ralphie described her, the archetype of the Southern matriarch. Tough, pragmatic, straight-talking, and utterly immovable. She was the only pillar of stability in his chaotic world, the immovable object that held their broken, fragmented family together. She was the one who provided what little structure and safety he knew. And in the midst of that chaos, she taught him a skill. It was a skill that, for a young boy in rural Arkansas, was profoundly unusual. It was a skill that, improbably, would come to define his entire future. She taught him to crochet and to quilt. In a world defined by a rigid, almost cartoonish masculinity, where boys were meant to hunt, to fish, to play football, this young, overweight, and sensitive boy was sitting at his grandmother's side, learning to work a needle and thread. This, in itself, was an act of quiet rebellion, but it was the lesson that mattered. This was not just a hobby. It was his first apprenticeship in the creative process. He learned how to take disparate, unrelated, and worthless scraps of material, the bits of fabric no one else wanted, and methodically, patiently stitch them together. He learned how to follow a thread. He learned how to build a complex pattern from a simple center. He learned how to create a warm, complex, and cohesive whole from a pile of literal scraps. Decades later, on a stage in front of thousands of people, he would do the exact same thing. His entire comedic style, the 20-minute-long narratives that became his trademark, was born from the lessons of his grandmother's quilt making. He would take the scraps of his life, a piece of childhood poverty, a patch of racial tension. He'd observed a scrap of a news story, a remnant of a fight with his wife, the giant absurd fabric of his own body. He would lay them all out for the audience. He'd pick one up. So, I was at the Waffle House the other day, and for 20 minutes he would stitch. He'd pull a thread from that story and connect it to another. The audience would laugh at the individual pieces, but often they wouldn't see the larger pattern. They'd think, where is this going? He was following a thread they couldn't see. And then at the end, he would pull that final thread, and the entire beautiful, intricate, and hilarious quilt would be revealed. It was the work of a master craftsman, and the craft was learned at his grandmother's knee. But that craft was forged in isolation. At home, he was an artist in training. At school, he was a target. He was the fat kid. And in the brutal medieval social hierarchy of a 1980s public school, the fat kid is the number one target. He was the other. He was poor. He was sensitive. He was different. He was a walking bullseye for every bully and every insecure adolescent in Clarksville. He learned very early that he had two choices. He could be the butt of the joke, or he could be the one telling the joke. He chose the latter. He became the class clown. But this was not the joyous, happy-go-lucky clowning of a well-adjusted child. This was a sophisticated, desperate defense mechanism. His wit was not a toy. It was a shield. It was a weapon. He learned that if he could make the bullies laugh with him, they would be momentarily disarmed. They wouldn't laugh at him. He learned to strike first. If he made fun of himself, his weight, his poverty, before they could, he disarmed them. He controlled the narrative. This was the birth of the second great pillar of his comedy. His grandmother gave him his structure. The bullies gave him his strategy. Make yourself the first target. By owning his own flaws, by painting himself as the biggest, most absurd character in the room, he earned the right to talk about everyone and everything else. He was a kid with a craft and a strategy, but he needed heroes. He found them not on the sports field, but on the flickering light of the television screen. At 9 years old, he watched The Tonight Show and was mesmerized by the cool, effortless control of Johnny Carson. Carson was the king. He was the goal. But his true idols, the men who spoke to his soul, were the rule breakers. They were the outlaws. He devoured the comedy albums of Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, and most importantly, the screaming, iconoclastic ex-preacher of comedy, Sam Kinison. These men weren't just telling jokes about airline peanuts. They were speaking forbidden truths. Pryor was turning his pain, his addictions, his heart attack, the racism he endured, into breathtaking, transcendent art. Murphy was a supernova of charisma, a rock star in a comedian's body. And Kinison was a revelation. For a kid from the Bible Belt, hearing a man who sounded like one of his hometown preachers scream about sex, hypocrisy, and the sheer absurd rage of being alive wasn't just funny. It was a spiritual liberation. These men were turning their own pain into power. For a poor, overweight, and bullied kid in Arkansas, this wasn't just entertainment. It was a revelation. It was a blueprint. It was a way out. At 13 years old, Ralphie May was already writing his own material. He was developing a persona. He was a kid with a singular driving ambition. He was going to be one of them. He had the tools from his grandmother. He had the armor from his schoolyard battles. And he had the heroes to light the path. He was a boy made of pain, poverty, and profound intelligence, and he had just found his calling. At 16, fate dealt Ralphie May two hands at once. The first was a divine anointing. He entered a local talent contest where the grand prize was opening for his hero, Sam Kinison. Ralphie won. After the show, Kinison himself pulled him aside, validated his talent, and gave him a sacred piece of advice. Move to Houston. It was the ultimate validation. The second hand was a sentence of lifelong pain. It was the year he met his God and the year he met his demon. Weeks later, still reeling from his triumph, he was a passenger in a catastrophic car accident. The details are brutal, a testament to the random, physics-based cruelty of the universe. He was thrown from the vehicle. His body, the large frame he had always inhabited, was shattered. He didn't just break a leg or an arm. He broke 42 bones. His spine was fractured. His ribs were shattered. His legs were crushed. His body, in effect, was obliterated. The damage was so severe, the trauma so total that his system simply shut down. He fell into a coma, a dark, silent, and dreamless void. He remained there, suspended between worlds, for 10 days. When he woke up, his life had been permanently and irrevocably altered. The person who went into that coma was not the person who came out. The recovery was agonizing. But agonizing is too small a word. It fails to capture the sheer mind-numbing, minute-by-minute horror of it. He was immobilized. He was bedridden, a prisoner in a body that was now just a collection of broken parts, screaming in protest. His recovery wasn't a matter of weeks, it was a matter of months, stretching into the better part of a year. For an active teenager, it was a prison sentence. A 16-year-old is a creature of pure momentum, a bundle of energy and hormones. To have that momentum halted, to be trapped in a single room, in a single bed, staring at the ceiling while the world you were about to conquer continues without you, is a psychological torture. And this immobility triggered a catastrophic secondary disaster. The weight he had always struggled with, the fat kid armor he had worn his whole life, now exploded. This is perhaps the most misunderstood part of his entire story. The man the world would come to know, the 800-pound comedian, was not born of a simple character flaw. He was not just a man with no discipline. The origin of that man, the man who would become a cultural icon because of his size, was right here in this hospital bed confined to his back, his metabolism wrecked by the trauma, his body desperately trying to heal itself by hoarding every possible resource. The pounds piled on. They piled on relentlessly, compounding the immobility, which in turn compounded the weight gain. It was a vicious, unbreakable feedback loop. His body, in its effort to save him, was also entombing him. The weight that would eventually climb to over 800 pounds was, in the most literal sense, the direct physical scar of his accident. But the accident left more than just physical scars. It left him with a legacy. It was a legacy of torment. It was the legacy of chronic, debilitating, and lifelong pain. His back, his legs, his hips, his entire frame. It was all a network of old, poorly healed injuries. From the moment he woke from that coma until the moment he died, there would not be a single day where he was not in pain. It became his constant companion, a screaming, invisible passenger he would carry for the rest of his life. And this pain became the source of his other great demon, the demon that would, in the end, prove even more deadly than the weight. To manage the physical agony, he began to self-medicate. It started innocently enough, as it always does. It started with prescribed painkillers, a desperate, legitimate attempt to find a moment's relief, to quiet the screaming in his bones. But relief is a powerful and seductive force. The pills offered a temporary peace. They offered a small, warm silence in the middle of the noise. Slowly, insidiously, that search for relief morphed into a powerful, all-consuming addiction. The thing he used to manage the pain became a pain all its own. The accident at 16 had not just broken his bones. It had set a tragic, unavoidable, and fatal course for the rest of his life. This defining, clarifying, and devastating event did one other thing, however. It clarified his purpose. He had survived something that should have killed him. He had faced extinction, looked into the void, and been thrown back. The frivolous, abstract dreams of a teenager were burned away, replaced by the hardened, desperate resolve of a survivor. He wasn't going to waste his second chance. He was on borrowed time. He had a choice. He could stay in Clarksville, an invalid, a tragic story, the fat kid who got in a bad wreck. He could live a life defined by his limitations, by his pain, by his trauma. Or he could listen to the ghost of Sam Kinison. He clung to that single piece of advice: move to Houston. It was no longer just a good idea, it was a lifeline. It was the only path forward that wasn't a slow death in his childhood bed. So at 19, his body barely healed, walking, as he would for the rest of his life, with a pronounced limp, his bones held together by pins and scar tissue. Ralphie May left Arkansas. He moved to Houston. He was a teenager, on his own, in a massive, unfamiliar city, with nothing but a dream, a body full of pain, and a terrifying, burgeoning addiction. The Houston years, from roughly 1990 to 1998, were his true education. This was his college, his boot camp, his monastery. He was, in his own words, baptized in the fire of the Houston comedy scene. He performed nearly every single night. He took any open mic spot he could get, in any club that would have him. He wasn't a star, he was an apprentice, learning his craft in the trenches. To pay his rent, to eat, he worked a series of grueling blue-collar minimum wage jobs. He was a dishwasher. He was a line cook at a steakhouse. He was deep in the service industry, a world of absurdity, long hours, and real people. This, for him, was a goldmine of material. He wasn't some coastal comedian observing the working class. He was the working class. He understood their frustrations. He understood their language. He understood their quiet, simmering desperation. But the most important education he received in Houston was cultural. Houston was and is one of America's most diverse cities. And in the 1990s, the comedy scene was in many ways just as segregated as the rest of the country. There were white clubs, there were black clubs, there were Latin clubs, and Ralphie May, the fat white guy from Arkansas, was almost always the minority in the room. He learned by trial and fiery error how to make everyone laugh. He learned that he couldn't just tell jokes about other cultures. That was hacky, insulting, and a quick way to get booed off the stage. He had to learn to talk with them. His old strategy, forged in those defensive years in Clarksville, became his superpower. He would walk on stage in a predominantly black club, a 400-pound, 20-year-old white kid with a thick southern drawl. He would immediately address the elephant in the room, which in this case was him. He owned his identity. He made himself the first and biggest target. He was the big, broke, white trash guy. By turning the spotlight on his own flaws, by being more honest about himself than anyone else could be, He earned the right to talk about everyone else's. He didn't punch down. He didn't punch up. He invited everyone into a shared, honest, and hilarious space. He built a loyal, multi-ethnic, multi-racial fan base. Years before he was a household name, he became a fixture, a local legend. He was seen as the spiritual successor to the outlaw legends who had defined the scene before him, Sam Kinison and Bill Hicks. He was inheriting their mantle, stripping Southern comedy of its hee-haw caricatures and infusing it with intelligence, rage, and truth. By 1998, he had conquered Houston. He had spent 8 years in the furnace. He was a master of his craft. He was 26 years old, a seasoned veteran in a young man's body. He was ready. He packed his bags and moved to Los Angeles. He left the Houston furnace with all the confidence of a warrior who had earned his armor. He had the craft, he had the material, and he had the validation of his peers. He was ready to claim his throne. But Los Angeles is not a city that respects craft. It's a city that worships image. The Houston king was about to discover he was just another face in a sea of desperate, hopeful courtiers, and his greatest battle was yet to come. Ralphie May arrived in Los Angeles in 1998, his body a map of pain from the accident, his mind a finely tuned weapon from the Houston furnace. He was 26 years old, but he was a 10-year veteran of the trenches. In Houston, he was a legend, a headliner, a comics comic who had earned the respect of every scene from every demographic. He had followed his hero's advice. He had survived the forge, and now he was ready for his reward. The reality of Hollywood was a cold, hard slap in the face in Houston. He was a star. In Los Angeles, he was just one more overweight, unknown comedian in a sea of thousands. In Houston, his size was a part of his established persona. In L.A., he was prejudged as the fat guy, a one-note joke before he ever opened his mouth. The industry, then even more than now, was obsessed with aesthetics. It was a town of sitcom-ready faces, and Ralphie May did not have one. The entire economics of the comedy scene were different. Houston was a work town where you got paid to do long, meandering craft-building sets. Los Angeles was a showcase town. You didn't get paid. You performed for free, often in near-empty rooms at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, for the 1 in a million chance that an agent, a manager, or a casting director might be in the audience. It wasn't about the craft, it was about the hustle. It wasn't about the art, it was about the audition. He caved, as he would later put it. It was the L.A. comedian's term for the relentless, soul-crushing grind. He performed at the legendary clubs, the Comedy Store, the Improv, the Laugh Factory. But he wasn't in the coveted main rooms. He was in the belly rooms, the satellite stages, fighting for 5 minutes of stage time against 100 other desperate hopefuls. His material, the long, intricate quilts he had perfected, was ill-suited for the 5-minute hit-and-quit showcase format. He needed time to weave, to build, to pull. The audience in L.A. wanted a machine gun. Ralphie was a storyteller. He picked up a few tiny, almost insulting television roles. He was a glorified extra on shows like The Man Show and The New Tom Green Show. He was invariably cast as Huge Guy or Fat Man Number 1. He was a prop, not a performer. He was invisible. The years dragged on. 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002. The frustration was immense. He knew, with the unshakable certainty of a master craftsman, that he was funnier than the people he saw getting famous. He knew he was smarter. He knew he was better, but he couldn't get his foot in the door. He was too Southern. He was too blue-collar. He was too big. He was, in a word, wrong. By 2002, the situation was dire. He was 30 years old. He had been a professional comedian by his count for 13 years. He was exhausted. He was broke, living in a tiny, run-down apartment in the valley. His chronic pain was a constant screaming noise in his head, and his methods of managing it were a constant spiraling drain on his life and his finances. The addiction that was born in his hospital bed was now a full-grown monster, sitting next to him in his empty apartment. He was on the verge of quitting. This was the make-or-break moment. He had sacrificed his body, his youth, and any chance of a normal life for this dream. And the dream was dead. He was facing the very real, very terrifying prospect of accepting that his hero, Sam Kinison, was wrong. That the Houston furnace was not a forge. It was just a dead end. He was on the verge of packing his bags, of accepting that his life story was a tragedy, a tale of the fat kid from Arkansas who almost made it. And then in 2003, a lifeline appeared. A new reality television show on NBC, a kind of American Idol for stand-up, was holding auditions. It was called Last Comic Standing. To the established serious comedy community, the show was a joke. It was seen as cheap. A betrayal of the craft. Reality TV was the lowest common denominator, and competing in comedy was seen as antithetical to the art form. But Ralphie May wasn't an established serious comedian. He was a desperate man. He had nothing to lose. His real career path was a brick wall. This show wasn't a betrayal of the craft. It was a Trojan horse. It was a way to bypass the industry gatekeepers, the agents and casting directors who wouldn't return his calls. It was a way to take his case directly to the people. It was, in the most literal sense, his last desperate audition. For the producers of Last Comic Standing, Ralphie May was a gift from Central Casting. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a character. The unique look, the massive physical presence, the dramatic, almost unbelievable backstory of his accident, the loud, unfiltered Southern meets hip-hop personality. He was a television producer's dream. He was a story before he ever told a joke. But on stage, he was a nightmare for his competition. This was the moment his entire painful life had been preparing him for. He was not a new comic, nervous in the spotlight. He was a 13-year veteran, a hardened gladiator. And he took all the strategies he had learned, all the weapons he had forged, and he unleashed them on a national audience. First, he deployed the shield, the strategy born in the Clarksville schoolyard. He immediately, brilliantly addressed his weight. He made himself the target. He called himself the fat guy. He told self-deprecating jokes. He owned his size so completely and so charismatically that it robbed anyone else, the audience, the judges, the other comics, of the power to use it against him. He didn't just defuse the bomb. He lit the fuse himself and laughed at the explosion. He turned his biggest perceived weakness into his most undeniable strength. Second, he deployed the craft, the structure learned at his grandmother's knee, while many of the other comedians were delivering a string of disconnected, set-up punchline jokes. Ralphie was weaving, he was telling stories. He brought the essence of his 20-minute Houston quilts and condensed them into 5-minute network-friendly masterpieces. He wasn't just saying funny things, he was being a compelling character. The audience wasn't just laughing, they were leaning in. And third, he deployed his most dangerous and valuable weapon, the Houston education. He did something incredibly brave, something that could have ended his career on the spot. He brought the racially charged, brutally honest, and culturally complex comedy he had perfected in the diverse clubs of Texas to a primetime network television audience in 2003. He talked about race. He talked about stereotypes. He did it with the talk with, not at approach he had mastered. He used his disarming good old boy Southern drawl as a disguise for a profoundly smart, socially aware, and liberal-minded message. He was a white guy from Arkansas who was somehow, inexplicably, making a diverse America laugh together at their own differences. It was electrifying. It was unlike anything else on television. He dominated the competition week after week. He was the clear favorite. He was the most polished, the most professional, the most undeniable force in the house. He was, as he put it, a 300-pound black belt in a room full of amateurs. He sailed all the way to the finals, a head-to-head battle with another comedian, Dat Phan. The contrast was stark. Dat Phan's act was built in large part on his emotional immigrant overcoming hardship story. It was a classic, heartwarming American dream narrative. Ralphie's act was built on 13 years of relentless nightly grind joke crafting. Dat Phan was a compelling story. Ralphie May was a professional craftsman. The show, being a reality program, relied on a public call-in vote. And a public vote is often for the story as much as it is for the talent. When the votes were tallied, Dat Phan, with his sympathetic and compelling backstory, was declared the winner. Ralphie May came in second. In the moment, it must have stung to get that close, to be the undeniable professional in the room, and to lose to a public vote. But in the long run, it was the single greatest thing that could have possibly happened to his career. He got all the fame. He got all the exposure. He got all the national recognition of being the show's breakout star, its most memorable character, and in the eyes of many, its true winner. But as the runner-up, he was not bound by the winner's suffocating, multi-year, low-paying, and restrictive contract with the network. Dat Phan was locked into a deal. Ralphie May was a free agent, and he was, overnight, the most famous, most in demand, and most bankable comedian in America. He didn't just get his foot in the door. He was the door. The L.A. grind was over. The kid from Clarksville had finally, definitively arrived. He had used the system he despised to bypass its gatekeepers. He hadn't just auditioned. He had conquered. But this victory was unique. In losing the final vote, he had won the war. The title of Last Comic Standing came with a restrictive contract. The title of the People's Champion came with a blank check and a level of fame he was completely unprepared for. The failure to win. Last Comic Standing was the greatest victory of Ralphie May's life. As the runner-up, he was unbound. He was a free agent, but a free agent who had just starred in a primetime network television show for an entire season. He was, as of that final episode, the most famous, most recognized, and most in-demand comedian in America. The industry that had ignored him, the gatekeepers who had deemed him too fat, too southern, and too wrong, were now hammering on his door. His career didn't just start, it detonated. He immediately recorded his first comedy album and DVD, 2005's Just Correct. It was a massive hit, quickly certifying gold, cementing his new status. It was raw, uncut Ralphie, a compilation of the powerhouse material he had been perfecting for over a decade. The album cover itself was a statement, a close-up of his face grinning, with the title scrawled in a font that looked like a barbecue joint menu. He wasn't running from his identity. He was branding it. The album included footage from a recent USO tour where he performed for troops in Iraq. The most famous story from that trip was of him, a 400-plus-pound civilian from Arkansas, gleefully taking a swim in one of Saddam Hussein's captured opulent palace pools. The image was perfect. It was the ultimate good old boy move, an act of populist, absurd defiance. It cemented his persona as the lovable, unfiltered misfit who was now somehow on the world stage. Then came the specials. He became a staple, a kingmaker at Comedy Central. He rattled off a string of 4 hugely successful one-hour events that would come to define stand-up in the mid-2000s. Girth of a Nation, Prime Cut, Ostentatious, and too big to ignore. Later, his fame would grow so large that he'd move to the new giant Netflix for Imperfectly Yours and the aptly named Unruly. His style was a masterpiece of misdirection. He would walk out on stage, this enormous, shambling, lovable figure. He would lean on the mic stand, towel on his shoulder, and disarm the audience with that thick, friendly Southern drawl. He would make them feel safe. Oh, they thought, it's the fat, funny redneck guy. This will be simple. And then he would begin to weave his material was not simple. He was a profound thinker who had perfected the art of sounding like he wasn't. He delivered incredibly smart, nuanced, and socially aware commentary, all presented as a simple "what I saw at the Waffle House" story. He was a master of observational comedy, but his observations weren't about airline peanuts. He talked about the big, thorny, third-rail issues that other comics fled from. He talked about race, not with the hacky, stereotypical punchlines of his predecessors, but with the genuine, hard-won fluency of a man who had spent years as the only white guy in the room. He talked about the absurdities of racial profiling, about the cultural differences he loved, and he did it by always making his own white trash culture the biggest punchline. He talked about religion, not just mocking it, but engaging with the deep-seated, often absurd logic of the Bible Belt faith he knew so well. He talked about sex, not as a stud, but as a large man trying to navigate a world not built for him. He talked about politics, poverty, and the quiet desperation of the American working class, his people. The man the world saw on stage was a conquering hero. He was the lovable misfit who had won. He was the kid from the broken home in Clarksville, now a platinum-selling artist. He had the fame, he had the money, more than he had ever dreamed of. And he had the adoration of millions, a multiracial, multi-generational audience who saw him as their champion. In 2005, he seemed to complete the picture of perfect success. He married a fellow comedian, the smart, beautiful, and edgy Lana Turner. They were a comedy power couple. They moved into a beautiful home. They built a life together, and soon they had 2 children, a daughter, April, June, May, and a son, August, James Day. He was a father. He was a husband. He was a superstar. The bullied kid from Arkansas, the survivor of the car wreck, had made it. He had, by every external metric, won the game of life. The sad clown is a cliché for a reason. It is a cliché because it is so often tragically true. Behind the curtain, off the stage, away from the laughter and the lights, the man who brought so much joy was drowning in his own pain. The internal chaos that had defined his youth was not, in fact, vanquished by success. It was merely funded by it. The physical demons that had haunted him since he was 16 were only getting worse. His weight was not a character. It was a constant, life-threatening daily battle. In 2004, before Girth of a Nation, right at the moment his career was exploding, he underwent gastric bypass surgery. This was not a casual decision. It was a desperate medical intervention to save his life. He lost a significant amount of weight, dropping from his peak of over 800 pounds down to around 350. To the public, it was a new look, but it was not a cure. The body he had lived in for so long had been fundamentally damaged. His metabolism was a wreck, and the surgery itself brought a host of new painful complications. In 2005, in a move that was part publicity and part desperation, he appeared on VH1's Celebrity Fit Club. It was a public humiliation. He was a platinum-selling artist, a headlining comedian, reduced to being weighed on a cattle scale on basic cable. The show's drill sergeant trainers screamed at him, treating his complex trauma-induced condition as a simple lack of willpower. He only managed to lose 27 pounds during the show's run, one of the lowest amounts in its history. The narrative was that he was lazy or not trying. The truth was far more complex. It wasn't that he wasn't trying, it was that his body was fundamentally broken. The immobility from the accident, the years of morbid obesity, the metabolic damage. It was a prison from which there was no simple escape. And then there was the pain, the chronic, unrelenting, debilitating pain from the 42 broken bones. It never, ever went away. With his new life of relentless touring, of endless flights, long car rides, and cheap hotel beds, the pain was worse than ever. His back, his legs, his entire frame was a network of old injuries that screamed at him every single day. And his primary method of coping, the pills, had grown from a management technique into a full-blown, life-destroying addiction. With his newfound wealth, he no longer had to scrounge for pills. He could acquire them in vast quantities from doctors, from dealers, from an army of enablers. The addiction that was born of a legitimate need for relief was now a monster with its own appetite, a monster that sat in the passenger seat of his new expensive car. He was a man living two lives. On stage, he was the master of his universe, a king commanding an army of laughter. Off stage, he was a slave, a man in a quiet, desperate, and losing war against his own body and his own addictions. Then in 2011, his body nearly gave up entirely. He was on a cruise ship, a comedy tour at sea, when he contracted a severe case of pneumonia. But in his compromised, overweight, and worn-down body, a simple pneumonia was not a simple problem. The infection raged. It led to a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled from his leg and lodged in his lungs. It was a near-fatal event. He was airlifted off the ship, fighting for every single breath. He was hospitalized, his life hanging by a thread. He survived. But the experience, the visceral, terrifying feeling of suffocating of his own body trying to kill him, left a new, invisible scar. He was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, not from a psychological trauma, but from the repeated physical near-death experiences his own body had put him through. He lived on borrowed time, and he knew it. His public life was a string of sold-out shows and hit specials. His private life was a string of hospital visits, rehab stays, and relapses. The internal chaos was beginning to build, and it was about to breach the walls of the beautiful external life he had built. A body and a mind at war with themselves cannot maintain a peaceful border. The walls he had built, the family, the fame, the persona of the lovable giant, were built on a failing foundation. The internal chaos fueled by addiction and pain was no longer a secret. It was a visible, raging fire, and it was about to consume the last good thing in his life. This internal chaos began to destroy the external life he had built. In October 2015, his marriage collapsed. Lana Turner, his wife and the mother of his two children, filed for divorce. The split was not amicable. It was a brutal, public, and painful affair. Turner filed for sole custody of their children, citing his drug use, his addictions, and making allegations of verbal and emotional abuse. The divorce proceedings were a bitter, unresolved war that dragged on for the rest of his life. He was terrified of losing his children, whom he adored. He was, by all accounts, a loving, doting, and playful father, but he was also, by his own admission, a deeply flawed man and a raging addict. The divorce, which was never finalized, hung over his final years, a constant source of legal trouble, financial drain, and profound emotional anguish. He was a man in freefall. His health was failing. His marriage was over. His addiction was raging. And yet, he kept working. He toured relentlessly. The stage was the one place he was in control. It was the one place the pain seemed to quiet. It was the one place he was not a fat husband or a drug addict, but Ralphie May. The laughter of a crowd was perhaps the only drug that truly worked, the only validation that mattered. As his personal life imploded, his public persona also began to show cracks. Ralphie May was not a comedian who avoided difficult subjects. He ran directly at them, and no subject was more central or more controversial to his act than race. This put him in a precarious position. He was a product of the Sam Kinison and Richard Pryor era, a time when the First Amendment, the right to free speech, was the comedian's highest and perhaps only law. He truly believed that no word, no idea, and no topic was off limits, as long as the intent was comedic. His defense was his own life. He had spent his formative years in Houston, earning the trust of Black and Latino audiences. He didn't just perform for them, he performed with them. He considered himself an ally, an honorary member of the community. He truly believed that his heart was known and that this gave him a pass. This belief led him to the single biggest controversy of his career, his intermittent and very public use of the N-word on stage. His argument was one of context. He claimed he was quoting. He would reenact a conversation he'd heard, or he'd use the word in a way he felt highlighted the absurdity of racism itself. He argued that to censor the word was to give it more power, and that he as a truth teller had a duty to reflect the world as he saw and heard it. The backlash, particularly as the 2000s brought a new heightened social awareness, was intense. To his critics, his defense was irrelevant. He was a white man from Arkansas. The word was not his to use ever under any circumstances. His intent didn't matter. The impact, the hurt, the offense, the perpetuation of a violent slur was the only thing that did. It was a clash of comedic generations. Ralphie, the free speech absolutist, was colliding with a modern world that was reevaluating the cost of that absolutism. It wasn't about, can you say it, but should you say it? And for many, the answer was a definitive no. This controversy complicates his legacy. Was he a racially insensitive throwback, clinging to an outdated and offensive privilege? Or was he a boundary-pushing artist, a product of a multi-ethnic comedian community who genuinely believed in the power of talking about the thing to rob it of its power? The truth, like Ralphie himself, is likely somewhere in the complex, messy middle. He was a man who loved Black culture, who championed other minority comedians, and who also possessed a giant unexamined blind spot. He was, in his own words from his Netflix special, imperfectly yours. Imperfectly yours. It was both an apology and a defiant statement. He was a man in an acknowledged public freefall. His health was shattered, his marriage was over, his professional reputation was complicated by his own blind spots, and his addiction was in full control. He was, as he had been at 16, living on borrowed time. And that time, which he had stretched for 28 agonizing, brilliant, and painful years, was finally, suddenly running out. In the final days of his life, Ralphie May was doing what he always did, working. He had secured a coveted residency at Harrah's Casino in Las Vegas. It was the culmination of a long career, a sign of respect, a stable headliner status that he had craved. In the week before his death, he had even attended an awards ceremony where he was named Casino Comedian of the Year. He was professionally at the top of his game. But privately, he was falling apart. He had been battling a severe case of pneumonia for over a month. He was sick, he was weak, and he could barely breathe. Friends and colleagues begged him to cancel his shows, to go to the hospital, to rest. He refused. He had a residency to perform. He had a crowd waiting. The stage was his sanctuary, and he would not, or perhaps could not, abandon it. He performed his scheduled shows at Harrah's, sick and exhausted, pushing his failing body to its absolute limit. On the morning of October 6, 2017, a body was found at a private residence in Las Vegas. The body belonged to Ralphie May. He was 45 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. His heart, strained for decades by his weight, his lifestyle, and the relentless pneumonia he had refused to treat, had finally definitively given up. It was a brutal, predictable, and somehow still shocking end. The man who had survived 42 broken bones, a 10-day coma, multiple rehabs, and a near-fatal pulmonary embolism had finally been killed by a common infection and his own unyielding, lifelong commitment to the show must go on. The news sent a shockwave through the comedy world. Tributes poured in from every corner. Comedians from Kevin Hart and Amy Schumer to his old Houston compatriots and the youngest open micers shared stories. They didn't just praise his comedy. They praised his generosity. They spoke of a man who would, after his own headlining set, stay at the club to watch the newcomers. He would give them advice. He would buy them drinks. He would, in many cases, slip them a $100 bill, remembering his own days of being broke in a new city. He was a champion of the art form, a comic's comic who never, ever forgot the struggle. The tragedy of Ralphie May is that he was a man who could heal an entire room, but he could not heal himself. His comedy was a bright, generous, and powerful light, but it was generated by a terrible friction. It was the product of a life defined by the grinding of pain and trauma, and that friction eventually wore him down to nothing. His life and death are a profound and profoundly tragic contradiction. He is the classic, almost archetypal example of the sad clown paradox. He was a man who manufactured joy for millions, yet he was personally consumed by a pain that was both physical and psychological. He was a man who preached a gospel of honesty, yet he was undone by the very addictions he tried to hide. His true significance, however, lies in his unique contribution to the art form. He was not a set-up punchline comedian. He was not a prop comic. He was not an impressionist. He was a storyteller. Remember his grandmother's quilt, that is his legacy. He was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest comedic quilt makers of his generation. He would take the scraps of his life, the worthless, painful, ugly, and forgotten pieces, and he would meticulously stitch them together on stage. He'd pick up a scrap of childhood poverty in Arkansas. He'd stitch it to a patch of racial absurdity he saw in L.A. He'd pull a thread from the pain in his own back and weave it into a story about the arrogance of a Hollywood doctor. He would follow that thread for 20 minutes, pulling the audience along with him, often into dark and uncomfortable places. They would laugh at the individual pieces, but they were in his hands, following him, trusting him, even when they didn't know where he was going. And then at the last possible second, he would pull that final thread, revealing the entire complex, beautiful, and hilarious pattern he had been weaving all along. This was his genius. He took the good old boy Southern drawl, a voice so often associated in American culture with ignorance, and used it as the perfect cover. It was a brilliant vehicle for a hyper-intelligent, deeply sensitive, and socially liberal mind. He disarmed his audiences with the sound of his voice, which allowed him to slip in profound, challenging, and uncomfortable ideas. He made people laugh at things they didn't even know they were allowed to think about. His life is a story about the cost of comedy. He didn't just use his pain for his act. He burned his own life for fuel. He took his trauma, his accident, his addictions, his failing marriage, and the absurd, painful prison of his own body, and he offered it up to the audience, night after night. He gave it to them in exchange for the one thing that seemed to heal him, the one drug that truly worked, their laughter. He was a man who was quite literally killed by the very things that made him famous. His size made him a star, and it killed him. His say-anything honesty made him a legend, and it made him a pariah. His relentless work ethic made him a king, and it prevented him from going to the hospital when he needed to most. His death leaves a giant 800-pound hole in the comedy world. He was a man interrupted. He died at 45. In comedy years, he was just hitting his stride, his mind still sharp, his voice still powerful, even as his body was failing. We are left to wonder what other masterpieces he would have woven, what other painful truths he would have stitched into laughter. His memoir, published after his death, was aptly titled "This Might Get a Little Heavy" for Ralphie May. It always was. He was a lovable misfit, a friendly giant, a brilliant mind, and a profoundly broken man. He was a storyteller who wove the ugly, painful scraps of life into something beautiful, and he was, in every sense of the word, too big for this world.